It was almost to the effect as if a surgeon had gone in and removed the lung.
Have you formed an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty on the cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I have.
Would you please tell the jury what that opinion or opinions are?
Yes, Mr. Floyd died from a low level of oxygen. The cause of the low level of oxygen was shallow breathing. Small breaths, small tidal volumes, shallow breaths that weren't able to carry the air through his lungs down to the essential areas of the lungs that get oxygen into the blood and get rid of the carbon dioxide. That's the alveoli at the bottom of the lung.
What happened in the case of Mr. Floyd that relates to the shallow breathing that resulted in his low oxygen?
So there are a number of forces that led to that the size of his breath became so small. And so there are a series of forces higher up that are leading to that. And the main forces that are going to lead to the shallow breath are going to be that he's turned prone on the street, that he has the handcuffs in place combined with the street, and then that he has a knee on his neck, and then that he has a knee on his back and on his side. All of these four forces are ultimately going to result in the low tidal volume, which gives you the shallow breaths that we saw here. And so the air will not be able to reach those air sacs we just saw in the video where the oxygen is exchanged and the carbon dioxide is removed. So they were forcing his left wrist up into his chest, forcing it in tight against his chest, forcing it high up. And you have to keep in mind that the opposite side of this is the street. So he was being squashed between the two sides. And so this meant that he couldn't exert his pump handle, because the street totally blocked his pump handle. There was no way he could do any front to back movement. And again, the way they were pressing in on the back, there was absolutely no way that he could do any front to back movement. Then in addition, because of the knee that was rammed in against the left side of his chest, sometimes the knee was down on the arm or in against the chest, so this would have the same effect. So basically, on the left side of his lung, it was almost like a surgical pneumonectomy. It was almost to the effect as if a surgeon had gone in and removed the lung. Not quite, but along those lines. So there was virtually very little opportunity for him to be able to get any air to move into the left side of his chest. So he was going to be totally dependent on what he'd be able to do with the right side. The left image, you see the finger on the street. Then over on the right image, you see his knuckle against the tire. And to most people, this doesn't look terribly significant, but to a physiologist, this is extraordinarily significant, because this tells you that he has used up his resources and he is now literally trying to breathe with his fingers and knuckles. Because when you begin to breathe with your rib cage and your diaphragm. The next thing you recruit after that is your sternomastoid muscle, which is the big muscle in your neck. And then when those are wasted up, then you're relying on these types of muscles like your fingers to try and stabilize your whole right side, because he's totally dependent on getting air into the right side. So he's using his fingers and his knuckles against the street to try and crank up the right side of his chest. This is his only way to try and get air to get into the right lung.
Explain why the knee on the neck is so significant.
The knee on the neck is extremely important because it's going to occlude the air getting in through the passageway. What you're seeing is the orientation of Officer Chauvin. His body build is quite erect here, but in particular what you're seeing is that the toe of his boot is no longer touching the ground. This means that all of his body weight is being directed down at Mr. Floyd's neck. there, because in many of the calculations I excluded the effect of his leg and his shoe because some of it was touching the ground, but here you can see none of it is touching the ground. So we're taking half his body weight plus the weight of his half the gear, and all of that is coming directly down on Mr. Floyd's neck. So there's a key finding that you're seeing here, and that is when you see his leg going up. And you have to keep in mind he's prone, so he's facing down. So this is his leg coming up backwards. And so that's what we call as clinicians, that's an extension movement of the leg. And that is something we see when somebody suffers major brain lack of oxygen. And it tells us at that point he's having what are sometimes called a myoclonic seizure, sometimes called a hypoxic seizure. There's different terms that are used, but really they all amount to saying that you're seeing here fatal injury to the brain from a lack of oxygen. The restraints continued after that. He has the cessation of respiratory efforts. When he last take a breath, the knee remains on the neck for another 3 minutes and 27 seconds after he takes his last breath. There's the knee remains. After there's no pulse, the knee remains on the neck for another 2 minutes and 44 seconds. After the officers have found themselves there's no pulse, the knee remains on the neck another 2 minutes 44 seconds.
Thank you, Dr. Tobin. No further questions.